Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us for today's program. Before we start, I would like to thank our co-sponsors, the American Jewish Historical Society, our partner here at the Center for Jewish History, as well as the National Museum of American Jewish History in Philadelphia. My name is Lauren Gilbert. I'm the Senior Manager for Public Services here at the Center for Jewish History. And if you joined us a little early, you saw a slideshow featuring some upcoming programs. My next author event will be on May 27th at 4 p.m. with Leah Garrett, who is the author of X-Troop, The Secret Jewish Commandos of World War II. It's a fascinating story. I hope you can join us for that. And you can see all of our upcoming CJH and partner programs and sign up for them at the calendar link on our website, cjh.org, and programs for the National Museum of American Jewish History at nmajh.org. When you registered, you should have received a link to purchase Bugsy, the book we'll be discussing today, at a 30% discount. I'll put the link in the chat as well a little later. Oh, and the chat is turned off for participants, but you can put all your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll get to as many of them as we can after my conversation with the author, but feel free to put them in as we go along. All right, so let me introduce Michael Shnayerson, who's our author today. Michael is a longtime staff writer at Vanity Fair and the author of 8 nonfiction books on a wide range of subjects. His Vanity Fair career resulted in 75 feature stories over a 3-decade period. His book career began in 1989 with the biography of novelist Irwin Shaw. He went on to write 3 narrative nonfiction books on broadly environmental subjects: Electric Vehicles in the Car That Could, Drug-Resistant Bacteria in The Killers Within, and Mountaintop Coal Mining in Coal River. He then veered toward social political subjects, working with Harry Belafonte on his memoir, My Song, writing an unauthorized biography of New York Governor Andrew Cuomo, The Contender, and telling the story of post-war contemporary art dealers who helped elevate the careers of today's best-known contemporary artists in Boom, Mad Money, Mega Dealers, and the Rise of Contemporary Art. His current book is a short biography of Jewish gangster Bugsy Siegel for the Jewish Lives series produced by Yale University Press. And thank you for joining us today, Michael.
Sure, nice to be here.
All right, so let's jump right in. As I just mentioned, the book is part of Yale's Jewish Lives series. And I've looked at the list of former subjects, and Bugsy's definitely the first noted criminal and murderer in the bunch, which mainly includes, up to this point, artists and intellectuals. So whose idea was it to include him in the series, and what were those discussions like?
Well, you're right, Lauren, that Bugsy is certainly the first criminal out of 50 short biographies published by Jewish Lives. It may surprise you, but the person whose idea it was to do Bugsy, indeed the same person whose idea it was to do the Jewish Lives series, is Leon Black, the financier, who saw in Jewish Lives a wonderful opportunity to reach a lot of people with biographies that weren't too difficult to handle. He got to Bugsy because he admired Bugsy as, and by the way, I should really give him credit, that is Ben, and say Ben, not Bugsy, but we could talk more about that. At any rate, Leon saw a brilliant businessman in Ben, and that indeed he was the first person to build and operate a sort of global scale casino that really changed Nevada and the whole casino culture. But I think he also saw Ben as an exemplar of the Jewish American story of someone coming to this country or his parents came to this country in the late 19th century, early 20th century, and struggled against so many odds. Malcolm Gladwell has a great essay on this, and he calls it the crooked ladder. The ladder of success was there, but not necessarily if you were Jewish and poor. So right there is a lot to justify, if you will, a Bugsy biography. And as I went into it, I found there was a lot more as well.
Okay, so tell me a little bit about the research you did for this book, and particularly the research you did here at the Center for Jewish History. I know you thank one of my staff, J.D. Arden, in the book.
Yes. Well, J.D. was great. steered me to some very helpful sort of genealogical stuff, information about Jewish families from Eastern Europe struggling under terrible situations, and then, of course, making the trip to America. And that was Ben's family story as well. His family came from Galicia, and they arrived in 1903 on a ship, and so there was information about their background. There was information there was the ship's logs, which I could also get through CJH. Through them, I learned, for example, that Ben's father, when he arrived, had all of $15 to his name. And just a little colorful detail like that is very helpful in understanding the plight that a family like Ben's father and mother were in. I got some help from the census reports, which at that time, the 1890s, 200 thousands, 1910s, et cetera. The information in those census reports was really detailed and colorful. For instance, you could learn that Ben's family took in boarders, and that here were their names. One was 17, one was 18. I don't know in the end what it provided in essential information about Ben, but it was quite fascinating. And so that was help I got from CJH. I also looked into the FBI files. A whole trove of FBI files about Ben had been released some years before. Unfortunately, the FBI loves to redact everything that it issues, and there was an awful lot of redaction. So that wasn't so helpful. But again, little bits of color, like a memo from one FBI agent to J. Edgar Hoover saying, Virginia Hill, who is Ben's inamorata, is a woman of terrible morals, and she's promiscuous, and she's never worked a day in her life. And you can imagine J. Edgar Hoover getting this and getting all steamed up. Did it advance my story? Not exactly, but it was fun. So anyway, those are some things to note about research. And the last thing I would just say is, this was a time, 1930s and 40s, of enormous excitement in newspapers. If you lived in New York City, you could get like 8 newspapers in the course of 24 hours. And these newspaper reporters were really serious shoe leather reporters who, really looked hard into their stories. So there's enormous color from them. And I would say that plus 2 biographies that had been written on Ben were really my best resources.
I know you also interviewed some of his descendants. So were they open to meeting with you, and did you learn a lot from them, and how do they see him?
Yeah, Ben, sadly, was shot to death on a June night in 1947. So there aren't any descendants living now. He had a daughter who died a few years ago. I tried to reach her at the start of my campaign here, and she was dying, and I wasn't able to get to her. I did speak, however, at great length with a granddaughter, Wendy Rosen, and she gave me a sense of how the family felt about Ben. The truth was they had great conflicted feelings about him, because he was a gangster. He was known for murdering people. He was known for racketeering, and so it made them feel hypocritical, understandably, when they accepted the money that he gave them to, let's say, put their son Maurice through school, as in fact he did. So anyway, Wendy gave me a sense of their conflicted feelings about that. She said that whenever Ben's name came up in the kitchen, her aunt would go sort of shuffling around somewhere into another room, because she didn't want to have to accept the fact that they were talking about Ben.
So you open the book with a great quote by Meyer Lansky that reads, "Look at the Astors and Vanderbilts, all those big society people. They were the worst thieves, and now look at them. It's just a matter of time." So do you feel like this sort of less savory aspect of Jewish history tends to be glossed over in the myth of the model minority? I mean, you mentioned this a little earlier with the crooked ladder.
Yes. Well, let me say, the idea of propriety of these criminals, be it the Vanderbilts or the Bronfmans or whoever, that they became as elegant as they did, is a sort of universal thing. In Ben's situation, from a very early age, he would cut a swath through the speakeasies of town. He would be wearing a full length, cashmere coat and a snap brim hat, and these are things that made him look like the aristocrat he certainly wasn't, but that he aspired to be. And we should go back a little bit and just set the scene for how Ben came, even at that young age, to be living the glamorous life he did. He had started off, his father was a pants presser in a factory and never did any better than that. It was a brutal life. The whole family lived on the Lower East Side. They were actually quite Orthodox. There's a synagogue only a couple blocks away called the Bialystoker, people who came from that part of Eastern Europe. And interestingly, Ben's father, the pants presser, died in the spring of 1947. And when he did, Ben paid for a memorial plaque for his father to be in this Bialystoker synagogue. And only 2 months later, Ben was killed. And his brother, Maurice, the one that Ben had put through medical school, bought the memorial plaque for his brother. At any rate, it was a tough time. And if you were a kid in that part of New York, you just learned to be tougher than all the other kids. Ben was probably on his own by the age of 7 or 8, although he would later tell his daughters that he had dropped out of school in the 8th grade. But I think he probably did that sooner because there was nothing in it. School, there was nothing in it for him. Also, he was excited by gangs. This was a time of kids in gangs, and the Irish had their gang, and the Italians had their gang, and the Jews had their gang. And so Ben learned all the things that gang kids do, like threatening, pushcart peddlers, threatening to burn down the stables in which other shopkeepers or whatever kept their horses. He learned these things, but he probably would have gotten nowhere for this knowledge. He probably would have ended up in jail, if not for two things. And this is, if you take away nothing else from the book, it's this, which is that when Ben was about 13 or 14, he was playing in the streets, and this kid who was younger than he, and rather a short, diminutive kid at that, saw that Ben had just pulled out a gun and was about to engage in a gun battle with other kids. And so the short kid pulled Ben away and said, "What are you doing? You shouldn't do that. I mean, you're going to get arrested. You'll be in jail for the rest of your life." That was Meyer Lansky, who became Ben's lifelong friend and who was just as ruthless as Ben, but far more even-tempered. The other important thing to put in there, because that sets up the whole scene too, is prohibition. These kids, for them, prohibition was absolutely a godsend. They could go from being desperately poor to working on driving bootleg trucks, and indeed Ben and Meyer started their own sort of extermination group called the Bugs and Meyer mob. And basically, they would just take money to shoot people, usually rivals in the bootlegging business. But at any rate, that is what set up Ben to very quickly make a fortune. Really, by the age of 21 or 2, he was a rich guy. When he married his wife a few years later, he moved her to a suite at the Waldorf Astoria. So just to go full circle back to your point about the Vanderbilts and others, the families, Ben was right in that tradition of they say behind every family is a crime, a great crime. And to some extent, that was certainly true of Ben. And just like the Vanderbilts and the others, he was able to rise by virtue of that brutal action.
And to that point, I've heard of a few genealogists who discover sort of these skeletons in their family tree, like these, criminals that they didn't know about or beloved ancestors who they discover, through looking at newspaper articles, weren't as clean as they thought. So in a lot of cases, I mean, this is out there, but it's been suppressed over the generations. But of course, if you're Bugsy Siegel and you're a famous criminal, it's kind of hard to suppress.
Yeah.
So you were just mentioning prohibition, which created the opportunity. Can you talk about how that also led to the arrangement with the Italian mobsters?
Sure. Ben and Meyer through the 1920s were just incredibly successful, but not without a lot of risk. The Italians had sensed the opportunity. They had gangs of their own in the Lower East Side, but also there was gunfighting, dramatic enmity between the two Italian subgroups called the Mustache Petes. The Mustache Petes were literally the old style gangsters, and they were brutal enough to be killing each other and to be killing Jewish gangsters as well. So in 1930, I think it was, maybe 1931, a number of gangsters, including Ben, created a syndicate, actually had a meeting in New Jersey, in Atlantic City, just after, by the way, Ben and Meyer had gotten married to respective girls from the old neighborhood. Each guy was the other's best man. But then they went off to this meeting to create the syndicate. And basically what the syndicate said was, enough killing already. We've had too many people dead. As a matter of fact, Al Capone's Valentine's Day massacre had occurred only a few months before. So the syndicate was a way of trying to make this far-flung group of gangsters into businessmen. And that sort of goes back to Leon Black's point. It was Ben as a businessman that you began to see. It was Ben as a businessman who began to become even more successful. It's very important to point out here that in 1933 came the end of Prohibition. I mean, the gangsters knew it was coming, and that was the other reason why they held this meeting and created this syndicate. They needed something to get them beyond booze. And as a result of that creation of the syndicate, Meyer basically took Florida. That was his turf. And everything would be very organized. And if you wanted to do business in Florida, you had to clear it with Meyer Lansky first. Ben decided he would take Southern California. And so literally in 1933, the very year that Prohibition ended, he came out in a fancy car and started looking around to see what ways of money he could find that were, considerable and illegal. So he actually started by calling his best friend, George Raft, well-known actor who was had started as a gangster and was a buddy of Ben's. And George introduced him all around to people in Hollywood. And pretty soon, Ben was calling himself a sportsman. Now, what was a sportsman? A sportsman, to us might mean someone who played golf or went sailing. But to Ben, being a sportsman meant doing those things and at the same time gambling, racketeering, and occasionally murdering when it seemed necessary. So that was the next chapter in Ben's life. I always think of Ben had 3 acts, really, which is one of the things that's so fun about him. It was fun to write about him. Act 1, Lower East Side, the poverty, all that we've talked about. Act 2, Southern California, and there's more to be said there. And then Act 3, of course, Las Vegas. So the only thing I'll just say before you speak is that there was enormous opportunity. It was very much like Chinatown, the cars, the clothes, the opportunities were just as tantalizing as they were for Ben.
And we're calling him Ben, not Bugsy. You want to talk about his nickname? I guess he didn't like his nickname.
Yes, he hated his nickname. He got it early on because, in fact, he did have a terrific temper, and that truly terrified people, as it was meant to. Why did he have the temper? Well, it's hard to say. Nick Pileggi, the wonderful crime writer who wrote Goodfellas, told me that he thought in a way there was a simple explanation to it. I mean, Ben was a businessman, and the best way to do his business, the particular business which he had chosen to do, was to terrify everyone else and keep them away. But Bugsy, as a name, was obviously interpreted by many people as being, that he was crazy, and he didn't like being, described as crazy. I don't think he was crazy. I think, there is a little FBI memo in one of those files that says, well, of course, Ben was, along certain courses of thinking, completely insane. Others thought he was insane too, but if he was insane, he did awfully well for quite a while before it got the better of him.
Well, let's talk a little about the contradictions in his character, because he was a devoted family man, yet also a terrifying killer with a scary temper. So how was that reconciled with members of his family?
That's a good question. I think, for one thing, like many gangsters, he was embarrassed by his father. In fact, both Ben and Meyer, now that I'm thinking about it, say in one place or another that they were embarrassed by their fathers, who were working in factories, who had no incentive to rise, even if the way they would be rising is via the crooked ladder. The sons just saw their fathers as pathetic, and they were not going to be that way. They wait, what am I trying to say here? Just this, that the father never actually, neither father ever actually got anywhere in life, and Ben was forced to deal with that.
But he was very devoted to his daughters.
Well, that's right. I mean, he had 2 daughters that came along very soon into the marriage, Barbara and Millicent. And at first, he brought them up to the Waldorf Astoria, then bought them a fancy house in Scarsdale. Amusingly, you can see the house from above using global Earth, and you can see that the house, which was built in the 1920s, has 3 routes of egress, three escape routes. Anyway, Ben was devoted to his daughters. He was actually devoted to his wife Esther, who had grown up in the Lower East Side, who's a very sort of shy, sweet woman whose only real goal was to have children and be Ben's wife. She was devoted to him really for the rest of his life. And indeed, after Ben died, Esther was asked, well, what did you know about Virginia Hill, Ben's later inamorata? And she said she'd never heard of her. Just like that, never heard of her. And she would have stayed married to Ben even still if he had just hadn't left her alone so often. And it is true, he did often go off alone, because this is the other side of Ben, that he was busy doing business, racketeering or killing as need be. And how could a guy who could be devoted to his family go out and without any hesitation kill, let's say, Big Harry Greenberg, a squealer who needed to be dispatched? Well, he needed to be dispatched, but why did Ben have to do the job himself? Why didn't, in typical gangster style, why didn't he hire some low-level thug to do it? Well, because Ben was brutal, because he was possibly a little crazy, as the FBI agent had said, because he was a sportsman in this sense we're talking about, which was actually a sportsman of crime. It's perverse, it's contradictory, and in the end, I don't have an answer except to say that both sides were definitely there.
Yeah. I mean, in terms of contradictory, you also talk about like the Orthodox contract killer who would never kill on Shabbat. Just sort of this cognitive dissonance. But
my favorite characters, yes, Red Levine was known for being a very good hitman, but one who if he possibly could avoid it, would not kill anybody on the Sabbath. If he did, however, if someone said, "No, sorry, Red, this is really important, you got to go out on a Saturday," he would put on his skull cap, he would, kiss his mezuzah, whatever, and they would go out and do his work of killing. And as Rich Cohen, a wonderful writer, said in his book Tough Jews, he said, the way these people thought was, next year the diaspora, but today we do what we need to do.
You started talking a little bit about his wife and Virginia Hill, his mistress. So let's give us sort of the overview about the women in his life.
Well, sure. Like many gangsters, he had the proverbial sweet hometown girl in Esta, whom we've discussed. But as soon as he got out to L.A., and by the way, away from his family, who he left in that house in Scarsdale, as soon as he got out there, he began romancing actresses, like a million guys before him. There was one actress, her last name is Gallienne, and she was French. And Ben, according to George Raft, spent $50,000 trying to teach her how to lose her French accent. And it never worked. And she was eventually kicked out of whatever studio she was in. And Ben went on to another actress named Wendy Barry, who's actually a rather successful actress. But none of those were as compelling to him as Virginia Hill. So Virginia Hill, very poor girl, grew up in Alabama, managed to get her way to the Chicago World's Fair, and then to ingratiate herself with the gangsters up in Chicago, where there are a lot of gangsters, and to become a sort of courier for them. And with this, she began getting an awful lot of money. And somehow she and Ben met through probably through another gangster named Joe Dodo. And almost immediately, the two of them had this, animal attraction for each other. I mean, they were, in a sense, kindred spirits. They'd grown up scrappy. They'd made it all on their own. And they're also both very tough. We described Ben as the, as Bugsy, as the man capable of violence. Well, Virginia was exactly the same way. And they were, classic makeup, breakup makeup relationship, where there was a neighbor across the hall at the Chateau Marmont who would hear them. It was one of their many trysting places, the Chateau Marmont in Los Angeles. And there would be just wild yelling within and things being thrown, and then they would emerge looking well-dressed and happy. So, Virginia was enough of a heartthrob for Ben that he was willing to actually divorce his wife. and to, in effect, leave his children, which I think which hurt him considerably. There's a wonderful letter that I put in the book, which he actually wrote to Esther, his soon-to-be ex-wife, worrying about all the things they had to worry about with their two teenage daughters. But it wasn't enough to keep him from leaving home, and so he did. He and Virginia began together then working on the Flamingo. And there's probably a piece or two to be inserted there about how he got to that. But let me just say that Virginia took a strong interest in the Flamingo as it began to go up in 1945. She became the person who designed the whole interior of it, not very well. And she may have been the person who persuaded Ben to start skimming from the till. And I'll tell you about that, but go back to what you were going to say.
Okay, well, just to go back a little bit, the Flamingo, in case anyone doesn't know, was his swanky casino in Las Vegas, the first of its kind, and where he was killed. You do offer various your theory about the murder, and I don't want to give any spoilers.
Then, because actually he wasn't killed there at the Flamingo.
Oh, that's right. I'm sorry, but
in Las Vegas, L.A. But let me just say this because it's sort of fascinating. Ben had gone through the 30s as the sportsman that he was, ever more well-known and kind of admired in the way that gangsters are admired. He built this 23-room mansion up in Holmby Hills. He would invite Hollywood stars to these evenings. There would be gambling. And also, inevitably, sooner or later, Ben would sort of sidle up to one of these famous guests of his and ask him for a loan. Would he mind? Would Jimmy Stewart mind if he gave, $500 to Ben? And the actors learned pretty quickly not to worry about this, and certainly not to ask for their money back, because that was probably not a good idea. Anyway, Ben remained glamorous through this period until a very unfortunate mistake. I may have mentioned it briefly in passing. Big Harry Greenberg, a squealer who someone was going to have to kill. But why did it have to be Ben? There was no reason, except, amazingly, because Ben wanted to. Because if someone needed to be killed, he was the guy who wanted to do it. So he did, in fact, with a few other guys in a big Packard, draw up to Big Harry Greenberg's house in LA and killed him. And in the past, he probably got away with quite a number of killings like that. But he didn't this time, or at least it looked like he wouldn't, because two other very important gangsters turned state's evidence. Abe Twist Reles and another guy I've forgotten. But they actually were willing to testify against Ben. This is 1940, 41, and to say that he had been very much a part of the plan to kill Big Harry Greenberg. And so there was a trial. It was stopped or ended, and then something quite amazing happened. Abe Twist Reles, the stool pigeon, jumped out of a sixth-floor window in the Half Moon Motel in Coney Island, where he was being guarded by 12 policemen. And with that still unsolved flight out from the sixth-floor window, Ben was able to avoid a guilty plea and probably the electric chair. And it was then that he realized his act two was over and he'd better leave LA. He sold the mansion. He stopped hanging around with as many of the actors as he had. And he started looking for a new life in Las Vegas. And at some point in there, Virginia Hill began living with him. They began building the Flamingo. They did have this idea, really, Ben had this idea that it was going to be far more glamorous than any casino ever built. And the only trouble was that Ben actually knew nothing about building casinos. He knew what he liked, but he knew nothing about how to do that. So he hired a guy named Billy Wilkerson, who was a restaurateur, sort of impresario, to help him. And for a few months, it went pretty well. And then Ben began to feel that he could do the whole thing himself, and Billy Wilkerson ought to just step aside. Billy Wilkerson had no choice but to step aside. Ben took over, and the $1 million budget for building the Flamingo skyrocketed up to $6 billion. And I'll tell you more about that, but tell me if we're running out of time.
We can go for a couple more minutes and then we'll switch over to Q&A, but do you want to talk about some of the suspects in his unsolved murder?
Sure. Well, I mentioned before that Virginia and Ben may together have been skimming from the till. At any rate, the other gangsters, the ones who put up the money for him, were furious. They believed it. So when Ben was shot, and by the way, in the bay window of Virginia Hill's home in Beverly Hills on Linden Drive, oddly enough, very vulnerable. I mean, why someone in Ben's situation would do that, no one has ever satisfactorily explained. But at any rate, he was killed, and the first thought was other gangsters whom he'd borrowed money from, and he hadn't paid them back yet. And the Flamingo, though it would start to make money, wasn't making money fast enough to satisfy these guys. So it could have been them. And in fact, there was a meeting in Havana in 1946. Just as the Flamingo was opening, these gangsters were meeting in Havana to decide what to do about Ben Siegel. And the consensus was that he should be killed. So it's very possible that those guys, carried out their intention, except that the Havana meeting was in December and Ben didn't die until June. Well, if they'd wanted him killed, they could have operated a lot more quickly than that. I think my theory is that Virginia Hill actually had something to do with this, because I believe she and Ben had been skimming in their desperation. Virginia then did something very odd and untypical for her. She left. She went to Paris for the whole summer. And there's a strong suspicion that she may have gotten the word from one of her gangster pals that it would be a really good idea to leave town until something happened, meaning until Ben got shot. She did leave town. She went to Paris. And I think that by doing that and setting Ben up to be killed, she was essentially buying her way free. She could easily have been targeted herself. She probably was, but if she was able to give them Ben and make it easy for them to target him on a June night in 1947, perhaps she could go on to a life of her own and not fear being killed herself. That's sort of what happened, except sadly, she was so depressed for the next several years that she tried to kill herself about 6 times and finally succeeded.
So to switch gears for 1 second, can you talk just a little bit about Ben's interest or lack thereof in Jewish causes as compared to Lansky?
Yes, that's a good story. We'll tuck that in quickly here. The fact is that Meyer had been very strong supporter of Israel. Before the war, he had sent vigilantes to break up Bund rallies. Ben didn't seem to be interested in being a Jewish philanthropist until perhaps the war ended and the scope of the Holocaust came clear. And like any Jew, he was absolutely horrified, criminal or not. So when someone called him up and said, "Hey, there's a guy here, an Israeli military officer who might be good for you to meet," Ben said, "Okay." And this guy came in, his name was Reuven Daphne. He's a very elegant, military officer for the putative state of Israel. And Ben listened to a long dissertation from him on why he should give some money. And finally, Ben leaned forward and said, okay, I just want to know one thing. Are your Jews going to kill? And Daphne said, well, yes, if necessary. Are they going to really kill? Because if they don't kill, I'm not giving you any money. If I need to know these guys are killing. And Daphne said, they're killing. Absolutely. And of course they were. They were building a state of Israel, and there was violence. So for the next couple of months that Daphne was in Hollywood trying to, raise money from other people, studio heads and whatnot, every week a shopping bag full of cash would be deposited in Daphne's room. And that was the money from the Flamingo that was going to help the cause.
So what do you think is the source of our fascination with Bugsy, and should we be wary of romanticizing him too much?
Oh, I don't think we should be wary of romanticizing him. He's so fun. Why not? I've loved romanticizing Ben, but I should be serious in a sense about that, because though I do think he is a romantic figure in the sense that he had these high hopes for doing something that was glamorous and that could elevate him to a high station in the American life. Nevertheless, he did, after all, do what he did at the point of a gun. And how much can you romanticize or admire someone who shoots people who are helpless? I mean, believe me, when Ben went to shoot someone, the other guy didn't have a fair chance. Ben pulled out a gun and plugged him. And it's hard to entirely, in all seriousness, it's hard to entirely romanticize someone who lived that way.
So what do you think his legacy should be, if anything?
Oh, I think he has a legacy. First of all, I can't tell you how many people in the last 3 years, when I said I was writing a book about Bugsy, they'd say, oh, of course, Bugsy Siegel. I mean, he is absolutely, I would say, universally known. And there's a great deal of curiosity about him, the stylish clothes, the daring, et cetera. That in itself is a legacy. I mean, it's incredible how enduring his reputation is in the stories. The second thing, obviously, is the Flamingo, and the importance of creating a casino that was not just big, but glamorous, and not just glamorous, but important enough as a new cultural touchstone to change the entire way Nevada operated, let alone the rest of casino culture. So, that's certainly part of the legacy. But I would just end by saying that there was also the legacy of coming to this country, or really of his parents coming to this country in the early years of the 20th century, and managing to achieve a degree of fame and fortune when so many were unable to do that. Again, he was a criminal, that's true, but I think you have to give him credit for the figure that he became in the United States. And I'll just say one other thing. Italian gangsters go on generation after generation. There's a great sense of pride in the Casa Nostra. That's not the case with Jewish gangsters. Jewish gangsters, they were reluctant to do what they did, proud when they did do it and did it well, but not particularly interested in perpetuating a line, a heritage of of criminal descendants, or to just put it simply, no interest in perpetuating Jewish gangs.
It was a way out.
Yes, which is
Yeah.
why today you don't see any Jewish gangsters. I mean, some gangster might coincidentally be Jewish, but there's no Jewish gangs. They really faded out probably by the 50s. Maybe you would still see casino owners who were Jewish and in a sort of gang-like way, but really it was about, the whole thing was, as I say in the cover, the dark side of the American dream, in order to prove yourself and make the money needed to prosper in the bright side of the American dream.
Well, that seems like a good place to stop, and we do have a lot of questions here. So let's go through some of those. How accurate is the Warren Beatty movie Bugsy, and what happened to Siegel's family? There's a rumor that his oldest daughter became a doctor. Is that true?
That's sort of interesting. First of all, the Warren Beatty movie I think was great. I think it portrays both Bugsy and Virginia Hill, played by Warren Beatty, very well. And there are some great embellishments to it, which I won't get into now. Your questioner asked, what was the other question?
About his daughters. Was one of them a doctor?
Yes, sorry. To the best I know, neither daughter had anything to do with his criminal life. In fact, I think your questioner has it sort of inverted. It was Maurice, Ben's brother. There was 5 kids, by the way, three daughters, 2 sons. Maurice was the brother who with Ben's money went to medical school and became, I'm told, a pretty well-known doctor, a surgeon in Beverly Hills.
Okay. Do you know where in Galicia his family came from?
You know, I don't know exactly. I looked, at the Center for Jewish History on that. There are a couple towns where he could have come from, but really the whole area was so sort of spread without definition in many cases that it's hard to know.
Someone who arrived a little bit late is asking about the Leon you were talking about. Can you explain again who Leon Black is?
Sure. I mean, Leon Black is a financier. He is very devoted to a number of causes. The Metropolitan Museum of Art. He's an art collector. And his company, Apollo, is very, very successful financially. So, all of us who wrote these books for Jewish lives are grateful to him because, to be honest, a short biography is unlikely to earn its writer a fortune. But Leon, in addition to sort of getting everyone excited about this, underwrote some costs and made it possible for us as writers to write these books.
How would somebody get a signed copy of your book? Oh, by the way, I will put in the chat before I end the Zoom the link to get the 30% off. But is there a way to get a signed copy, Michael?
Well, I'd be delighted to sign them. I at the moment in Malibu, and if your readers or your listeners are in New York, it's easy enough to arrange. Well, let's talk about that afterwards. There must be some way to do that.
Okay, so whoever is interested in a signed copy can write to lgilbert@cjh.org. That's me, and then we can figure it out with Michael later.
Yes, and thank you for the thought, by the way, and thank you, as many of you can, for buying the book. I will say that I've written 8 books, and this is the one that is, I won't say it's the best book. I just think it's the most fun. Bugsy is such a fun character, and so I stake my reputation on that being a fun book to read.
Some of these, I think we were probably asked before we then went on to answer them. So let me see. He was said to be the first Jew in Scarsdale. Is that true?
No, no, absolutely. They're not. There are several other wealthy Jews who settled in Florida, in Scarsdale. And I'm sorry, I'm not coming up with their names, but I did some research. There's a little book about Scarsdale, and the author ticks off a number of.
But you did mention that it was not a Jewish area, and they weren't very welcoming to Jews.
That's right. It definitely was anti-Semitic to some degree. The little book I alluded to about Scarsdale describes a fairly typical situation in American suburbs where the Jewish family looking for a house to buy is gently steered toward the other side of town, and the rest of the neighbors who are anti-Semitic are not tainted by that other Jewish family's arrival. Yeah.
So someone is asking, do you believe that Ben's wife knew nothing of his escapades?
I don't. I mean, I can't say for sure, but I would say it would be impossible for Esther not to know that her husband was involved in all sorts of crimes. Even from the start, when they began going out together and going to these speakeasies, I mean, people had to have told Esther, do you know who your boyfriend is? Do you know who you're taking up with? And of course, later on, once Ben got to LA and became a more visible character, he was identified readily in newspaper articles again and again. And of course, then when he actually was implicated in the murder of Big Harry Greenberg, I mean, what wife could not have known that?
Question, did he just kill Jewish gangsters, or was he involved with violence against other ethnic groups?
Very good question. There's a wonderful biography by a guy named Dean Jennings. Boy, that's made such a difference for me. He was one of these shoe leather reporters of an earlier time, but he was fascinated by Ben, and he also was fascinated by George Raft, and he wrote a biography of Ben, and the very title of the book is "We Only Shoot Each Other," and that was apparently a line that Ben uttered to his builder of the Flamingo, one which the builder remembered with chills ever after.
So here's a question about another quote. Did Lansky really say about the syndicate, we're bigger than General Motors?
I think so. I don't think that's in my book, is it?
I don't recall it being in your book.
I've heard the phrase. I don't know if it's true.
Can you talk about Ben's relationship with Abner, Longies, Wilmin?
Oh, yeah. Well, Abby Wilmin was sort of the head of New Jersey, at least the part of New Jersey near Manhattan. They call him Longie because he was very tall. And in the beginning, he was a gangster, just like, a gangster kid of the streets, just like Ben. And he had a whole gang. He was the head of a gang. And one person described how eternally grateful he was when the Irish gang turned the corner and started coming after them. And people started shouting, where's Longie? Where's Longie? And then Longy would come around from the other corner with his guys, and they would, fight it out. At any rate, Longy went on to become a very successful gambler, a very successful gangster, although I believe it didn't end well with him.
Here's a question. Wikipedia notes that Wendy, Barry, and Bugsy may have had a daughter named Carolyn. Any credence to that?
That Wendy and
Bugsy had a daughter potentially?
Wait a minute. Wendy, say again who the people are you're talking about.
That Bugsy Siegel and his girlfriend Wendy may have had a daughter together?
Oh, Wendy Barry, the actress. Well, that's very interesting. I don't know. All I know is, Ben had two daughters, Barbara and Millicent. Barbara actually wanted nothing to do with her father and the whole organized crime thing, so she left for the Midwest and never came back. Millicent was actually part of, at least aware of her father's business dealings, and was sort of proud of them. Anyway, it's not unlikely that Ben did have a child with Wendy Barry, and I'm embarrassed to say, if that's true, then I remiss. I should have looked into it, because Wendy Barry was a well-known actress, and Ben was with her for at least a couple years while he was still in LA.
Well, but I imagine if he had acknowledged the daughter, you would have known, you would have come across it somehow.
Maybe, I don't know. Ben was still married to Esther at that time, and yet was able to pretty well flounce around without hiding his other romance. It's amazing that he could do that. He could do that with Virginia. He could do it with Wendy Barry. Wendy was a very elegant actress. I believe she was English. And so it's interesting that they had a romance that lasted at least a couple of years, but apparently they did. I'm going to go looking into that very interesting idea about the daughter.
Do you know if he was bar mitzvahed, Ben?
I don't think so. But I do know that Ben and Meyer were both married with rabbis attending. And also, as I may have said, that they were each other's best man.
Somebody's asking what happened to the rest of his fortune.
Well, I can tell you, actually, it was nearly all dissipated. When he was shot, he was just beginning to turn things around at the Flamingo, but he really owed millions of dollars to people, starting with that developer I mentioned with, but also the other gangsters who had invested in the Flamingo. So he didn't have much money at all. Esther, his widow, was left with what seemed like a lot of money until they looked into it, and then it turned out that there was virtually nothing. Oh, I remember when they had gotten divorced, only a year or so before, Ben had legally promised Esther that he would give her something like $600 a week for the rest of her life. Then he dies, and then it turns out that he never could have done that. He really had almost no money left.
All right. Well, in answer to the question,
I would just say that there was always the theory that Ben and Virginia squirreled away a lot of money in Swiss bank accounts. And if true, maybe he had some that we never did find. But in fact, when, in the aftermath of his death, when the papers were opened, there was almost nothing in there that he had left. Really, a couple rings and a watch. It was sort of sad.
In answer to the question, can you hear this program later? Yes, it is being recorded and will be available on the center's webpage, cjh.org, and our YouTube page. We are coming up on 5 o'clock, so I think we will wrap it up. I want to thank you very much, Michael, for taking
Sure.
this time with us. And it's a great book that I highly recommend. I did put the link to the discounted book in the chat. So thank you, everybody, for joining us, and I hope to see you all soon.
Great. Okay.
Take care. Bye-bye.